Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about education and race and ethnicity. The objectives for this chapter are to examine education as a cultural assimilator and a mechanism of exclusion. We're going to look at whiteness and education, the racial gap, and also affirmative action. To really be able to understand the association between race and education, we have to look at both economics and the education system, both of which are major institutions of society. And when you study functionalism, again, you have to say that what's the purpose of this institution? According to symbolic interactionism, humans interacting with each other, that is how we created the economy. That's how we socially constructed a capitalist economy. That's also how we socially constructed an education system. So when we're looking at the purpose of the education system, we have to really delve into, from a functionalist perspective, how does it function and what's its purpose? So from the education standpoint, you can look at it as one, education is a socializer, right? We learn from the education system, but what exactly are we learning is the overall question. And again, the purpose of the education system, one, is to socialize culture, a way of life. Another purpose of the education system is to be able to fulfill roles. And so the education system is a mechanism by which we can use examinations and training to be able to teach people to fulfill these roles. The education system also filters people into roles. So essentially, our system should be set up where it's meritocratic, right? So the best and the brightest, the ones who are the most successful, that are the most motivated, that work the hardest, should be allowed to rise up. But as we study sociology, we find that meritocracy is not necessarily a staple of our system, because those who actually have access to get the training, to get the knowledge, and be able to fulfill their potential and for their brain to develop the most are often the people that come from higher socioeconomic statuses. So we have to ask really hard questions about how the education system filters people into social classes. So again, the education system is filtering people and socializing simultaneously. So you have to ask questions. Like, for example, 35% of people graduate college on average. Okay, so is the education system failing if, higher percentages aren't graduating, or is that the purpose of the education system? To slowly filter people out so that the best and the brightest are the ones who end up, graduating from college and fulfilling those elite social roles. But what we're going to find is, again, throughout sociology, we're looking at how socioeconomic status, where you're located in the social system, and your parents' socioeconomic status is highly associated with whether or not you graduate from college, the job you end up getting after you graduate college, how much money you make, cultural capital, social capital. So what you're going to find is we live in an unfair society. And that's a hard thing to say, that we live in a society that's not fair, that those who are growing up poor don't rise up the social class ladder as much as those that grow up rich. But that's the true reality of it. When I teach psychology, it's a really tough subject when I have to teach intelligence, and I have to talk about the association between socioeconomic status and overall intelligence. But when you study it, what's the most important thing for a child's intelligence? Having nourishment. And so think about children that are growing up in poverty that don't eat every single day. How is that affecting their brain development? Okay. And so this is what's really, really sad, is that based upon your socioeconomic status, that's associated with, your educational attainment and then your overall socioeconomic status. And so again, this is some of the hard stuff to talk about in sociology. And then the association between the education system, economics, and race is this, okay? So we live in a capitalist society. And again, the goal of capitalist society, the capitalists are trying to consolidate wealth into the hands of the few, right? So again, we go back to why were races socially constructed in the first place. Races were socially constructed in the first place so that we had a very clear-cut dividing line between social classes. Again, those that were from Europe and that were male were allowed to participate. They were allowed to go to college and compete for good jobs and compete for money. But if you weren't male and you weren't European, then you were subjected into the lower classes. And so, again, what happens when you subject an entire race of people into the lower classes? And how is that associated with overall educational attainment? And again, this is how we account for the racial gaps between whites graduating college 40% and blacks and Hispanics only graduating, 20 and 22%. And so we have to ask, is it a psychological thing for why there's a racial gap, or is it a cultural thing and a white privilege kind of thing? And so that's when we look into the purpose of the education system. Again, the education system is filtering people into social classes. And therefore, how did whites get a privileged position where they're able to get higher educational attainment to be better able to compete? And then how did whites suppress other people into the lower classes? And again, you have to ask questions, and your book talks about, why did white people not want black people to learn how to read? Because what happens when you learn how to read? What happens when women started reading books and believing in themselves and doing jobs that men do? Did that lead to several feminist movements and the civil rights movement and the continuing movements that we're seeing today? And so when we look at things like the Black Lives Matter movement and all the prior social movements before that, what we're going to find is that you're seeing groups of people, or minority groups, that don't want to be subjugated into the lower classes anymore. And they want to, based upon their merit, rise up the social class ladder. But because of racism and sexism, these people have been blocked from ever being able to share their genius with the rest of the world. And so essentially when you look back at all the books in history, and this is a sociology conversation, but again, it's always old white men. You don't hear about a woman until at least the 20th century, and minorities are not represented in the books. And this is why we need Women's History Month and Black History Month, because these minority groups were subjugated into the lower classes. And again, what's the number one way to end poverty? It's through education. And so the education system functioned, again, to filter people into social classes, and minorities were not allowed to go to the good schools. They did not go to good schools. Your book talks about, in a couple chapters ago, just look at the funding of schools historically, and the white schools were getting 150% more than the non-white schools, and that's really tough to talk about. But again, so the education system and the economy and race all work hand in hand. Again, races were created to have lower class workforces, and then the education system filters people into social classes. And so then you can see that what happens when you stick entire races of people into the lower classes. And then what's the association between lower class status and poverty and educational attainment? And again, this is the hard stuff to talk about, because community college students, are 50% less likely to graduate with a bachelor's degree than university students. And you have to ask why. Well, what's the difference in the socioeconomic status between community college students and university students? And then you start to see the effect of poverty upon education. So when you stick entire races of people into poverty, that's going to tank educational attainment rates. And so in the last 50 years, we're now opening our doors. Schools have become integrated for the first time. But again, it's always been a tough world for minorities just to be able to gain access. And the first door that needs open is the educational access. So again, is educational access equitable? And again, it's not equitable, because those people that come from higher socioeconomic status have higher graduation rates than people that come from lower socioeconomic statuses. And if you subject entire races, ethnicities, and sexes and sexual orientations, and you force them all into the lower classes, it's gonna affect educational attainment rates. So again, we need to look at the intersectional ways by which society is stratified into groups, and then your status within those groups is then associated with your education, your job, your wealth, your overall socioeconomic status. Okay? So the book opens up talking about the history of Native American schools. And again, the experience of Native Americans was the forced cultural assimilation. Europeans came in and imposed cultural imperialism, thereby which they removed other cultural ways of life, such as that of Native Americans and Africans, okay? And then the white schools already were more funded, but then they historically used the education system to again teach, socialize a European cultural way of life upon non-Europeans, and the book uses that word civilize. And again, this is how Europeans justified cultural imperialism. They justified as, well, we'll go in there and we'll civilize them and we'll make them all Christians, and then but again, they didn't consider that their cultural imperialism was wiping out an entire way of life, and how is that going to affect people. This is a really sad story, though, because when you look at Native Americans and how they were forced to go to these European-run boarding schools, and if their parents didn't agree to let them go there, they threatened their parents with death. And then the experience of the actual children in these schools is incredibly dark. Serious, many atrocities, many missing people, unmarked graves by the thousands. Literally, the Native American children were punished to death for not immediately assimilating to a European way of life. Okay? And again, the goal of these European boarding schools, when they were trying to civilize Native Americans, was to strip them of their culture and impose white culture, European culture upon them, essentially trying to indoctrinate them into whiteness. But again, what does whiteness mean? It's a cultural way of life. It's a capitalist society. It's domination and subjugation. It's war and violence and... Okay, so in the 1930s, we finally started to make some changes on this very negative part of American history, and we introduced things like bilingualism in the schools. And then by 1966, you had the first native-controlled schools, but again, you have 150 years of complete cultural decimation and atrocities committed against Native American children that doesn't often get spotlighted in the news. But again, this book uses the term the colonist education, and the goal was to literally wipe out indigenous cultures. Again, the history of African American schools. African Americans were historically excluded from education before and after Reconstruction. And again, why do Europeans want to exclude African Americans from education? Because that's the first door that opens up rising up the social class ladder. That's the first door to the awakening. And so whites didn't want African Americans reading books because they wanted to exploit them as a lower class workforce. And someone who has an education that starts to think for themselves, that has a mind, that has some power over their lives, is not going to let themselves be exploited. Okay, so again, the book talks about all of this. If Africans had an education, it would make it difficult to exploit their labor, and whites would have to pay for their education. And that's how whites, that was why whites wanted to exclude African Americans from the, getting education, because they didn't want them rising up the social class ladder. They wanted an exploitable lower class workforce. So we had separate but equal for a long time, where you had white schools and black schools. This again was challenged by the NAACP and the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court, of course, through Brown v. Board of Education, with Eisenhower using the National Guard, through the Civil Rights Movement, through the honorable role of the Little Rock Nine being the first non-white students to go to an integrated school. We began this path of social change that we are on now when it comes to racial relations in the United States, okay? But again, if you were African American, even W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first African American to have a PhD from Harvard, looked out at the American dream and said, even with my PhD from Harvard, it's inaccessible to me because of the color of my skin. Poor whites and blacks competed for jobs historically, and so this has always been a problem with uniting the lower class to be able to overthrow the bourgeoisie and to get some power over their lives. Again, there's a lot of examples of this in history, that if poor whites and all other minority groups had just come together, and then they could have, pushed workers' rights faster, pushed child labor laws faster, avoided being drafted into wars while the rich kids were exempted. I mean, just so many examples of this, okay? Again, the African American schools, they traditionally were not funded, and they really did not. Again, there's just a huge disparity between white and African American schools. These are words that I couldn't use, but this is just quoted out of your book. But again, one-room schools, or old word I can't say churches by underpaid, badly trained word I can't say teachers. And again, that's just a quote straight out of your book. Segregation persisted because simply integrating the schools was insufficient. It takes a systematic overall to overcome institutionalized racism. Again, so even though civil rights have gone on, are our schools segregated? Do you still see are all the schools diverse and representative of all minorities? And again, we've talked about many times about neighborhood exclusion when it came to housing, same thing goes for schools. You find that African Americans tend to go to schools that are heavily African American and not diverse, for example, and it continues today. The concept of the double consciousness is also introduced in your book in this chapter, and that is the idea of you are American, but you are also a Black American, for example. And so, you can't just see the world through an American point of view. You have to see the world through an American point of view that is intersectionally associated with also being Black and a Black point of view. Again, there's so many quotes from your book that I just had to bust some of them out. Like the poorer classes of whites, Gunnar Myrdal observed in An American Dilemma, are in competition with word I can't say for jobs and social status. One of the things that demarcate them as superior and increase the future potentialities of their children is the fact that white children in publicly supported school buses are taken to fine consolidated schools, while often word I can't say children are given only what amounts to a sham education in dilapidated schools. Okay, your book is incredible. I mean, really, it's just very powerful. Hopefully you guys are reading every word of it and then having the same experience as I have, where it just makes you want to be an advocate. Whiteness and education. So again, white culture. How did whites racially dominate? How did they gain racial supremacy? And again, this was the introduction to this lecture, is that through war and cultural imperialism, class subjugation, exclusion, this is how white privilege came about. And again, we've talked about this before, but not all whites have privilege, but all whites have access to privilege, okay? But again, how do you get privilege? It's all about socioeconomic status in the end. It's all about economics. Eurocentric curriculum is a Protestant ethic. So when you look at the social construction of the education system in the United States, you have to look at the dominant culture that created that education system. And that dominant culture was a Protestant, European, British way of life, okay, a British Protestant culture. And so that has been fused into the social construction of the education system. There are many ways to teach people. We could take kids out in the woods. We could teach them to build houses. We could do so many other things other than having them sit still for 8 hours a day. You have to wonder why ADHD diagnoses are on the rise. And is that just because not every child is meant to sit still for 8 hours a day, or do they actually have a disorder? So again, some things I'm very critical about. We're in sociology, so we're not going to delve into all the diagnoses. But again, that's, when you go to look at the education system and how it's socially constructed and why, you have to ask these questions. Another quote, "It is only through Mark Twain's enslavement of Jim, a black slave, that Huck Finn was able to experience freedom. And Ernest Hemingway made white women pure and beautiful by depicting black women as predatory and inhuman. Blackness was sullied to make whiteness shine clean and unblemished." And again, straight quote out of your book. And again, this just feeds into that. How did whites racially dominate? Not only did they do it through economics and socioeconomic status and class subjugation, but they also did it through ideology, hence the ideology of racism that became a huge structure of American society. Because again, the dark history of America is it's a sexist and racist place, and it's also very heterosexist and very often ethnocentric. Albeit we want to act like we, bring us your meek and your poor, everyone come from everywhere, Statue of Liberty. When we talk about immigration policies, you can totally see racism across the board against every single group, whether it's Eastern Europeans or Irish or Africans or Asians or Latin Americans, okay? There's not a point in American history that they're not racist or don't have racist immigration policies towards some group, okay? So a great question is, how do we decolonize pedagogical practices? And again, this is the idea of removing the cultural imperialism and really asking questions of what kind of an education system should we create? How do we remove white privilege from the education system? How do we let people that are growing up in poverty, just based upon their merit, have a chance to develop, have a chance for their brains to grow, have a chance to go to a good school and be challenged? And again, your book talks about maybe it's actually in a different class. But when you talk about this, the culture of social classes, and you have to look at how the lower classes, what type of development do those parents expect of their children? And then when you look at the higher social classes, you have to go and ask what kind of development do they expect of their children? And is there a disparity between parenting styles? And what you find is children of lower social classes, they hear the word no 4 times more than they hear the word good job. People of higher social classes say good job 4 times more than they say the word no. You also see that the schools themselves, again, there's natural development, which is the expectation of the lower social classes. And then there's the, pushing for more than just natural development. And if you look at psychology and you look at Vygotsky, again, you don't just become a rocket science naturally. Becoming a rocket scientist takes a ton of work. But the problem is the children that are coming out in kindergarten and first grade and second grade in really rough schools that are not being taught the skills to teach them that higher level learning are at a disadvantage right there. Then the children that are going and really getting the work, and the schools are really challenging them and forcing them to do more than just natural development. Again, this is where the disparity begins between social classes. And then the disparity between races comes because we pushed all minorities into this lower class. So again, all of this chapter, we have to really think about economics, the social class system, education, race, how do all of these things fit together, okay? And so, college level, minorities experience stigmatization on campus. Again, racism still exists. They experience differential treatment. Teachers grade non-whites poorer than whites. The dorm experience, the experience of being someone who's non-white in a primarily white dorm. Asians, they talk about the model stereotype, and that an Asian, what if they're struggling with science and how that deviates from social norms? Or a Native American at a party when someone else is dressed as a Native American? Or whites and men getting called on more than women and minorities? Thinking about holidays and mascots. Are Jewish holidays represented, or does the school just have a Christmas tree? Do whites feel uncomfortable in classrooms when talking about race? And again, as a professor, the first time I had to tell someone you're not actually black, white, or Asian was incredibly awkward, but you know what? You have to have the uncomfortable conversation if we're ever going to end racism and ethnocentrism. Microaggressions, professors having non-white students speak for all members of their race. These are all things your book talks about. And then again, the hate crimes being on the rise. And depending upon the epoch we're in, are there hate crimes against Jewish people? Is it hate crimes against African Americans? Or is it hate crimes against Asians or Muslims? Okay. And then this quote from your book. A black freshman was tormented by his white roommates who hung up a Confederate flag and a picture of Hitler, wrote a word I can't say on the room's whiteboard, and placed a bike lock around the black student's neck. These are real experiences of minorities. This is why we have to talk about racism. Educational inequality. And again, what's the origin of educational inequality? Again, it's institutionalized racism. It is subjugating minorities into the lower classes and then denying them life chances, denying them access to opportunities to education and jobs and wealth and overall socioeconomic status that includes cultural capital, social capital, and habitus. And habitus, again, is that way of life that's associated with your social class position. Again, your social class is associated with your culture. And that's Bordeaux if you guys are interested in any of that kind of stuff. So again, Hispanic graduation rates 21.4, blacks 30.6, Native Americans for a high school, are more likely to drop out than whites, 14.4%, and Asians. So again, you can see Hispanics, blacks, and Native Americans have higher rates of high school dropouts than whites. And then why do Asians have lower rates? And again, that's the association between race and culture and educational attainment. Is it cultural ideology of Asians? Is it expectations? Why do Asians have higher educational attainment rates than any other race? And again, we have to look at culture and ideology for that. College degrees. 58% of Asians have college degrees, 40% of whites. The average college degree for everyone is 35%, two or more races 32%, black 20%, Native American and Hispanic 16%. So as you can see, whites get twice as many college degrees as blacks and Hispanics and Native Americans, and you have to ask why. And again, that's why we look at the origin of race. Races were created so that we had a clear-cut line between social classes, okay? And then again, why do Asians have such higher rates? 20% more than, whites and 40% more than other races. And again, we have to look at culture for some of these answers. Why is there disparity? Again, class culture, institutionalized racism. Income of college degrees are increasing in general. However, this wealth disparity between races is also increasing, because if whites are getting more college degrees and then they're making more money than blacks who aren't getting as many college degrees, who aren't making as much money, then again you start to see that wealth disparity grow even more between races. So race is associated with test scores. Again, as we discussed, this is due to poverty effects, not race itself. Again, if someone's race has nothing to do with your intelligence. Like, that's absolutely ridiculous. However, poverty does. And again, that's why I kept talking about what happens to, what's the association between educational attainment and poverty. And as you can see, people in poverty are getting half as many college degrees. And again, that accounts for that twice as many for whites, because African Americans have been subjugated into poverty the entire time. Okay? And it's not just African Americans, it's across the board, but it's all people in poverty. And so that's really just a core theme that we have to look at. And again, gender differences persist too, although shifting more toward black women are getting more degrees, women are getting more degrees than men in general, so we're starting to see some major changes. So again, education and economics, which is what I've been setting you up for the whole time. Poverty and the unequal distribution of wealth is the overarching reason for the educational gap between any groups, whether it's, social class groups or racial groups, etc. Education system is a social class filtering system. Parents with higher socioeconomic status yield higher socioeconomic children. That's what I'm saying. There is an advantage to your parents' socioeconomic status, and then the school you go to that's associated with your parents' socioeconomic status, and how well that school is socializing you into a cultural way of life, but it's also socializing you into a class culture way of life. Okay? And then again, it is this book. So the middle class interacting with their children, they interact linguistically 3 times as more as poor children. Lower class are more discouraging than encouraging, and middle class tend to be more encouraging than discouraging. And again, socioeconomic status is associated with overall educational attainment and intelligence. And I know we don't want to have that conversation, but that's what's up. It has nothing to do with your race. It has everything to do with poverty. And so again, the best way, there's so many ways to fix social problems, but how do you fix poverty? Through education, okay? Straight out of your book, quote, studies have documented a direct correlation between cultural capital and academic achievement, test scores, and grades. So again, that's what I'm talking about. Your cultural capital, your social class location are associated with your overall educational attainment. So much that has to do with just the culture of the social class itself. The rest of it has to do with being access, the effects of poverty. And again, as we've been asking this whole time, what happens when you subjugate entire races and ethnicities into the lower classes? You're really just imposing the effects of poverty upon them. And the effects of poverty and educational attainment are incredibly discouraging. So cultural capital defined as the sum total of all cultural statuses, how you dress, walk, talk, knowledge, skills, again, and then your social capital, who you know, and then your socioeconomic status dictate your location in the class system. So again, it's really just that math equation. Education plus job plus wealth plus social and cultural capital equals your socioeconomic status, your location within the class system, which is then associated with your overall educational attainment. And why economic inequality and explaining racial disparities? Because again, the core of it all is economics. It's all about capitalism. Europeans wanted to dominate the elite social classes so that they could become the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie. They subjugated everybody else into the lower classes. They became the proletariat, and it's been the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat ever since. Again, the history of the United States is a history of domination and subjugation of non-Europeans and women, and it has taken hundreds of years to overcome these disparities. So cultural and education, again, educational disparities can be accounted for by culture. We do have to look at the culture of poverty. We have to look at different racial cultures. We have to look at different ethnic cultures. We have to look at the ideology of these races. How much of educational attainment is due to culture? How much of educational attainment is due to being blocked from access, or having access? So again, we're looking at culture, we're looking at the social class culture like we've talked about, we're looking at racial and ethnic culture, we're talking about ideologies, how much time is spent, we're looking at economic privileges, we're looking at the model minority, again, which is, imposed upon Asians. The book talks about some interesting things like winning the spelling bee. If someone is Asian and they win the spelling bee, what do people say? Oh, it's because they're Asian. And if they lose, are they surprised because they are Asian and didn't win? And again, this is how positive racial stereotypes can also skew our way of thinking. Your book also talks about how young Asian females have the highest rates of suicide amongst all the other racial groups, and you have to ask why. And again, you have to look at the culture and the ideology and how that's associated with social pressure, and how is that social pressure affecting young Asian females. Your book talks about why are African Americans expected to be perfect athletes, why the stereotype about Jewish people and money, where does this come from? The book also talks about African American oppositional culture. And you can look at it as a counterculture, but again, the book talks about it as like how the goal of it is to not act white. But really, what I like what your book says is that this oppositional culture that's adopted by cultures, which is also associated with not as having as high of educational attainment rate, isn't really a counterculture, but really it's one way of being able to hold on to a cultural identity. So by rejecting this idea of acting white and embracing a unique culture, that's holding on to a cultural way of life, but at the same time, it's also associated with a decrease in educational attainment. Again, and then in the book talks about the stereotype threat, and how's the stereotype threat associated with whether or not somebody goes to college, or even believes if they go to college they can get a job, and that kind of way of thinking. So inequality in school funding, it's hard to find teachers for poor schools. The effects of poverty upon education are very extensive. Colleges, again, how does the education system filter you? The book talks about the tracking system where you have honors, college prep, vocational, remedial. And again, this produces racial inequality because more Asians and whites are pushed into honors and college prep, and more Hispanics, African Americans, and Native Americans are pushed more into vocational and remedial schools. And again, the type of track that you end up on, the type of school you go to, is then associated with your cognitive ability, your overall intelligence. And so we can't deny the effect of poverty on intelligence. And that's really tough to say, that poor kids don't get the same chances to actually physically and mentally grow, but it's totally true. It sucks. And again, that's one big problem, a huge social problem, is that disparity in education between those social classes. Okay, and so again, there's a lot to this chapter. It's incredibly deep. And it finishes out with affirmative action. Really just, we had these policies and procedures that were put into place to make society more representative, to fulfill elite social roles with people that never historically were given a chance. So again, is affirmative action working? Totally. It's completely working. Absolutely. That's one of the only ways to really be able to fight off this covert, institutionalized racism, is to have affirmative action policies and to hold people accountable, and to have, diversity boards that consider diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because then we're looking at the statistics, and we're looking at the hiring managers, and we're asking, are they excluding people because of their race or their sex or their sexual orientation or disability status? And as the book said, yes, hiring managers totally do this. They hire white people 3 times to every non-white. They hire men 2 times to every woman. And again, how do we deconstruct some of these methods by which non-whites and females were blocked out from society? And again, the book talks about SAT scores and legacies and helping the poor. And, so the bunch of good ideas. But again, that's something you guys should think about. Is affirmative action working? Do we need affirmative action, and why do we need it? Okay. And then the multicultural learning environment. How can we overcome a Eurocentric curriculum and a structure to be more culturally inclusive? Again, look at our education system and ask, does it work? And does it meet the needs of all people in society? And is there a better way to socially construct an education system according to symbolic interactionism? Okay, thank you so much and have a wonderful day.